So easy to just go along and search just that. Maybe there's a little more to it.
Hello. My name's Howell.
Everybody's messing around for a long time.
Right?
That's really
Well, I just came from Steward Harper's constituency office. It was great. I wish it was for truth. It's just against that obvious stuff. Of course, we all brought our pots and pans.
Oh, that's what it was.
Yeah, we kind of did what
I thought it was
I'll look and see if I'm missing something.
There's something.
Thanks, Mike. It was great. It was called, we're looking for 13 heroes. 13 heroes / pastoral. Yeah. That's okay. We don't hold it against it. We can all find this down, look at our own way. Traffic was nice. You know the truth out of this place? That was that's a great opportunity we have there. Well, the kid is like 29, but you know, about my stepdaughter lives
Okay, we're gonna get started here and have the latecomers pile in as they go. Even though we started 10 minutes late, that's fine. Thanks for coming tonight, even though it was like raining like crazy. This is a town hall post-election 2012, kind of what the state of politics is after the election, where the progressive voice is going to be in the next 4 years. Those are the topics that we're going to cover today, and what role the media play. So our panelists are Dr. David Swann. He's the MLA for Calgary Mountain View. He won his 3rd term as MLA in the last election. He is the Liberal critic for health and wellness as well as human services. Next to him is Darrel Rowledge. Darrel's a longtime student of political science and public policy. He is currently an Alberta businessman and a public policy analyst. He has received numerous awards for conservative work and has spent over 20 years writing and speaking on a variety of public policy issues from forests to healthcare. On the other side we have, on the other side we have Gillian Steward. Gillian is a Calgary author and journalist. She currently writes a regular column for the Toronto Star and also writes for Openfile Calgary. She teaches journalism at Mount Royal University and is a PhD candidate in communication studies at the University of Calgary. And then right next door is Trevor Scott Howell. Trevor Scott Howell is the city editor for Openfile Calgary. Openfile is a community-powered news organization that focuses on reporting the underreported issues in the city. It's only online, but it's national. Their biggest focus is having a community-driven reporting. Trevor was also the staff writer at Fast Forward magazine prior to this role. So follows. Each panelist will have 5 to 7 minutes to address the issue on the last election and the role of the media in politics in general from their point of view. After each panelist has said their piece, we'll have a couple of prepared questions that so that we can expand the discussion and kind of get more into the issues. Then we're going to have a 15-minute intermission so that you can talk to the panelists all you want. And then we will open questions to the floor. So basically any questions that you want to have addressed specifically from any of the panelists or the group in general, and then we'll wrap up and everyone will have a 3-minute conclusion that they can have. So without further ado, we'll start with Dr. David Swann to open up the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you all for coming out. Let me also hasten to add that you don't have to have a question. You could make a comment. This is an open forum. It's not particularly partisan. I am very keen on engaging more people and thinking about and planning for a better future for Alberta, and particularly with a focus on our political culture and a government that actually listens and responds and plans further ahead for a longer-term sustainable future, I might say. So all suggestions are on the table, and you will not be cut off, really, for making your own statement about what you think is either the symptom, the diagnosis, or the prescription. And that's basically what I was going to offer, was from my perspective after 7 years in politics, into my 8th year at the end of October, I'm confused, I'm frustrated, and a bit angry, and I'm not quite sure what to do. Because I believe very strongly that we don't have good government, we don't have strong options, and we're selling out our children's future without much arousal in the province. I don't quite get the lack of understanding as I've come to see it. I don't see a clear diagnosis of what the problem is yet out there. And therefore, as a physician, I find it hard to make a clear prescription for what I think, from my point of view as a representative of the people, what is actually going to move us towards that more healthy, honest government, representative truly of the short-term and long-term public interest. How do we get there? I think we're the only province in Canada that when we get so frustrated with the government that we really get riled up enough to have 57% of us vote, and we vote for the same government again. Wow. After 41 years, we say that's good enough. It's the best we can do. So I know it's a complex issue, and these folks know a lot about politics and political culture, and I won't belabor it, but I guess what I needed to say is that after 7 years of studying this government, I'm more committed than ever to seeing a change of government. And frankly, I would rather have seen a minority Wildrose government to open things up and expose the rot and find out where our money has gone and force a better longer-term plan, even if we dump them in 4 years. To have some serious change in the province would just get more health and more honesty and more vision back into the province. So I just wanted to say 4 things that really bug me. And I think they're part of why we're in the state we're in, where people are not engaged, not optimistic about government or politicians, and not participating in creating a better government. The first is the influence of money. It's very clear when the Conservative Party spent $5 million in this election that it continues to be too much a factor in our democracy. As many have said of the US, we have the best democracy money can buy. Well, maybe we need to rethink that then. Maybe we should change the rules about financing and accountability, campaign reform. The second thing I see very strongly from the perspective of a non-politician, really, because I got into this game because I was so angry at the government that I decided to leave medical profession. It's the lack of citizenship, lack of people really feeling that they either have a role or that they have a capacity to perform a role that will be meaningful in the culture. And where does that come from, and how do we address that? The third thing is the contraction of media. And by contraction, I mean their unwillingness to spend too much time going into any depth on the issues and understanding, for example, where the money's going, to ask the tough questions, to try and get at much more and keep the focus on incompetence, mismanagement of our resources. And knowing the health system as I do, I just see a tremendous amount of waste. And when I investigate the books, I see millions and millions and millions of dollars that I cannot track. And the insiders that confide in me do not know where this money is going. And finally, we're getting the auditor involved again, and there are very strong recommendations by the auditor just before the reform in the health system, and he couldn't get accountability in the finances. So that's another example of where the lack of media focus and strength and maybe courage, because I think courage is a big theme for me in politics. We don't have enough of it in politicians, we don't have enough of it in the public, we don't have enough courage in the media to really tell the story. The fourth thing then is politicians are failures. There's a relationship between people and politicians, and both are responsible for the health of the relationship, just as in any relationship. You can blame the people for not being involved, you can blame the politician for not being involved, you can blame the media for not doing their job. We're all in this together, and we're all paying the price for not having a vital, engaging, well-researched, critical thinking process to go forward. So those were the symptoms, and I see it, I've identified the causes as money, lack of citizenship, media contraction, and politicians not doing their job and engaging people actively. What's the prescription? Well, based on that, I think I have some ideas about reducing the influence of money on politicians and their parties and their ability to campaign, increasing citizenship, starting with skill development in school and homes and all the things that we've heard about in terms of civics classes and that don't seem to work in this culture. Contraction of media, I don't know how you change that except to encourage more, such as these two independent journalists here who have written and continue to push the envelope on things that are not working, partly because they are independent, that they can, within somewhat impunity, they pay a price, as we all do, for challenging a government that's entrenched. And finally, I'm finished.
We're going to move on to Trevor, Scott, Howell, for him to make some remarks.
We can just call me Trevor.
I'm allowed
That's
to
just
full
my
names.
okay. So what I'm going to talk about just a little bit at first is just the role in the media, what role we play, and I just want to make it clear that I don't differentiate myself or Openfile from the rest of the media. We're just the media. But I think we got to expand on that a little bit, kind of define first what media actually means now. Historically, it's been traditionally newspapers, radio, and television. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, and as David talked about briefly, was that the media's just been contracting, and even still. Post Media was doing layoffs again recently, Globe and Mail. Everyone, the traditional media model is just crumbling and continues to crumble. But I think what we saw during this election was the emergence of, I'm not going to say citizen journalists, but people are starting, they have the tools now where they can blog about issues. And if you look at the issues during this election that really turned the tide, I think, it wasn't the mainstream media, if you want to use that term, that really picked those stories up. It was bloggers who picked those stories up. The conscience rights story with the Wild Rose wasn't picked up by the mainstream media first. It was done last September by Fast Forward Weekly and ignored until a blogger picked it up during the election. And then it got out on social media caught fire there, and then the mainstream media jumped on it. And you had bloggers like Dave Fournier, who blogs under Dave Burra, who did a piece about some of the thorny candidates in the Wildrose party. And then it wasn't until I think 10 days later that the Globe and Mail did pretty much the exact same piece. So while we see traditional news media that's on the decline, what we're seeing, I think, is the rise of reputable bloggers filling the holes. So whereas we're not going into like single sources, or like I get everything I get from the Herald or the CBC. You kind of have to search around a little bit to find the different reputable news sources now, but they are out there, and so I think you just have to look a little bit. So I fluctuate. I'm bipolar in the outlook of the news industry. Some days I just pull my hair out and think, why did I even get into this industry, at a time when it's just completely falling apart? But at the same time, I see it's like something, it's reinventing itself, and I don't have the hubris to think that I know where it's going to end up. I don't. But I'm not doom and gloom either. I think if anything, it's encouraging, because when you see more people who are producing news or contributing in some way, whether it's just on Facebook or blogs or even suggested stories, ideas to news outlets like Openfile, I find that encouraging, because it shows that people are becoming, in Alberta, in the 29 years that I've lived here, I don't think I've seen people as engaged as I have in the past 2-3 years politically. And I think it started more with the Calgary election, and I had mentioned it's kind of carried on there. I mean, 57% voter turnout isn't, don't pat yourselves on the back too much, Alberta, but it's better than it's been in years. And I think it's up to people now, the public, to really pick up the gauntlet now and run with it. And one of the other things that I think we're going to talk about is like, where's the progressive voice going to emerge now in the next few years? And I don't think it's going to be with any political party. I think it's going to be with the public that's really going to do that. And the public has to hold the fire to not only the feet of the governing party, but to the feet of the so-called progressive parties in this province, and the so-called progressive politicians, like the Liberal Party and the NDP and Naheed Nenshi. You can't just let them get off the hook because they're, self-declared progressives. I mean, with campaign finance reform on a local municipal level, okay, well, they talk a good game about doing things, but nothing's been done. So why aren't people protesting in front of City Hall about that issue, right? I don't know, maybe I'm kind of veering off here a little bit.
Well, you have 30 more seconds, Trevor.
Go Kings. I'm done.
Sounds good. I'm going to come back across to Darrel, and any comments that you have in the next 5 minutes about just politics as a state since the last election, or just in general.
Okay, first of all, thank everybody for coming. I think it's impressive to see this number of people out. One of the things that I found so fascinating in the last 2 elections, but the last one especially, was the whole concept that CBC did, where they had a vote compass. And they had this approach to looking at politics so you could figure out where you were by where you stood on major issues. So if you went down the list and you picked your point of view all the way down the list, where you stood on education and healthcare and environmental issues, social justice issues, all the way down the line, at the end you could hit the tally and it would tell you where you are, which party you most agreed with. And the thing that was so interesting about it, for a poli-sci guy like me, was that it was very consistently surprising to people, because this was, after all, conservative Alberta, and when they looked at their answers, well, this damn thing must be broken. Because all the way down it would be liberal, 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 and they wanted to vote for a conservative. Now, what I find interesting about this is that I've been following this stuff for a long time, and this entire pattern has been predictable. So, if you looked at what happened within the major areas of where political science veered off into selling politics, what you would find is pretty much exactly the same thing. And all of this stuff, all of the tools, all of the framing, all of the talking points, all of the tools that politicians use today, they've all come lock, stock, and barrel from the United States. There are books and books and books, trust me, because I've read them. And the interesting part about that was that years and years ago, Republican politicians found themselves in this bizarre situation. They were on the wrong side of most major issues from the general public. So how were they going to deal with that problem? Well, it just so happened that they had some great relationships with some of the biggest corporations in the world. And by about the 1970s, there was a realization within the corporate world that there is a disconnect between the military-industrial complex, a whole bunch of the major energy companies in general, and where a bunch of the issues were related to politics. So what actually happened was that these two good friends got together, the politicians and the marketers, the best marketing machines in the world that were selling soap or cars or whatever it was in advertising, figured out how to apply all of what they had learned to sell politicians and policy. And they have honed that science for 40 years. So, how effective has it been? Well, I'm going to tell you a little story. When Ronald Reagan came to office, elected in 80, came to office in 81, the United States was the world's largest producer of finished goods. Largest producer of finished goods. They were the world's largest importer of raw materials to make those finished goods. They were in an incredible position vis-a-vis the amount of money that was owed to the United States. More money was owed to the United States than any other country in the world. And if you fast forward to the end of George W. Bush, there's been a consistent move to adopt conservative Republican politics in the United States, both in the Congress and at the presidential level, and in the state houses and so on. And following a neoconservative agenda by and large, by the time George W. Bush was finished, the United States was the world's largest importer of finished goods, the world's largest exporter of raw materials. And the United States owes more money than any other country in the world. And yet, almost no one in the United States knows anything about this. So how is that? Well, that's the other side of the equation. Because for the public to understand this stuff, they have to be presented it by the media. But the major media discovered a long time ago that they wanted to make money. So if you ask the age-old journalism axiom about if you really want to find out what's going on, you just follow the money. So do that to journalism. Where does the media make their money? They make it from advertising. Well, who advertises? Well, big business. There's your first one. So there's not really a vested interest in biting the hand that feeds you. And if that was all it was, that would be, it wouldn't be perfect, but it wouldn't be bad.
I'm going to interrupt because we've hit 5 minutes and I kind of want to keep this on track. So you just want to conclude and that would be great.
Okay, so what turbocharges all of that is that we ended up in a situation where rather than looking at investigative journalism, it was in their best interest to make more money. So they would hire rookies, put a microphone in their hand and say, go get an opinion from that person, go get an opinion from that person, and they would put them out there as, I've done my job, this is balance. That's what the public gets. That's what the public votes on. It happened in the United States increasingly, and it's happening here, and it explains a whole heck of a lot about where we're at today. So I'll talk more about that later.
Okay. And we're moving to Gillian, and I'm sure she has a lot to say, so.
That'll be fine. 5 minutes worth, that's all I'm gonna be allowed,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
I want to talk about the election itself, because I see it not as gloomily as David does, perhaps. I see it as a good news, bad news story. I think, I think the bad news is that Albertans re-elected government that's been in power for over 40 years. And when any party is in power for that long, there's too much corruption, there's too much, insider stuff, there's just too much, as David said, too much money going places that nobody seems to know about. But I also think that this was actually, I've lived in Alberta for quite a long time and I've seen lots of elections. I think this was the most interesting election that we've ever seen. I've never seen people so engaged. People were actually talking about it. You could go into a coffee shop and they were having conversations about politics. People were thinking hard about who they were going to vote for. And I think that's change. I think it's a huge change. I think the Wild Rose, as much as I don't support most of their policies, but I think they stirred things up. And I think they got people thinking that perhaps it is time for a change, right? Perhaps these guys have been in power too long, and that's not good for the province. But then what happened is, through some of the Wild Rose candidates and through the leader herself, we learned more about what the Wild Rose would actually do if they formed a government, and a lot of people ran the other way. I think they were willing to vote for Wild Rose because they thought it was a change, a positive change. And let's face it, most people do not pay much attention to politics between election campaigns. So they had identified Wild Rose was change, and they thought it was time for change. But the good news is that when people really came to understand what Wild Rose stood for, particularly on social issues, they decided loud and clear that they did not want that. I think that was very clear. You live in a constituency where you actually had a choice. There was a good chance that a Liberal candidate or a non-conservative and a non-Wild Roser would get in. In the rest of the city, that was not the case. And I couldn't believe, in the last week of the election, how many people I talked to, people who I knew were Liberals that had been, bitterly opposed to this government for years, who said they were going to vote Conservative. NDPers who had been lifelong NDPers, who never voted any other way but NDP, no matter who the candidate was, said they were going to vote Conservative. Like, this is a huge shift, and it all happened within the last week. Personally, I was really glad to see, I wasn't glad to see a 40-year-old, the Tories in again necessarily, but I was glad to see that most Albertans rejected the Albertan stereotype that the Wild Rose offered. And I think people resoundingly did. I think they said, we're not homophobic, we're not racist, we don't believe in this idea of conscience rights, that public servants should be able to decide who they want to serve and who they don't. I think people resoundingly said, no, we don't want that. That's not my Alberta. And I think that's a good thing. I also agree a lot with what Trevor said in terms of this was a very different campaign in terms of the media. Usually, the Edmonton Journal, the Calgary Herald, CFCN, they kind of set the pace, and it's not a very quick pace, and it's not very fast, and they don't challenge very much. But I think a lot of the independent journalists, bloggers, a lot of the new media were able to get in there this time, and they were able to push the more conservative media into covering issues in a different way. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's, I think it's been opened up. I don't think it's good enough now for any citizen to actually just read the Calgary Herald and figure that they know what everything that's going on, because it's definitely not the case anymore. You do need to be your own editor in a sense. You need to get out there and see what you can see, what you can see on video, what you can see, what you can read. It's out there. And there's a lot of interesting stuff. And I think there's some smart people who are really challenging the way things have been done in Alberta for the last 20, 25, 30 years. And I think people are waking up. I think there's so many big issues here, and people are realizing that we are not just an outlying province anymore. We are a center of political power and economic power, and the decisions that are made here are really, really important. And I think more citizens are going to get involved in that. I think they are going to speak up. So we can get into ways to do that later, but that's all I have to say.
Okay. I think we're going to move into the question of what's next, because that's really a theme of this town hall, is with two right-wing parties, both as the government and as the official opposition, where will the progressive voice be in the next 4 years? How will a voice anything within legislature, within policy? And what do you think the next 4 years are going to be like? Do you want to start, David?
I'll make some quick comments.
Yeah.
I think the next 4 years are as critical, if not more critical, than we will be seeing in the next 20 years, because the resource issues, the climate change issue, healthcare, the growing seniors population, the challenge of new economy that is being really pushed upon us because we've been so slow in engaging the 21st century and the need for an economic reformation here, that our children and our grandchildren are going to pay a huge price if we don't take hold of the future and move forward in a more progressive fashion. And I'm not speaking specifically of a Liberal or a New Democrat or a Green or whatever party, but we have to, in my view, unite some of the progressive voices that are simply saying we want more openness in government, we want to know where our money is going, we want to know why we're continuing on this single-minded track for oil and gas and fossil fuel development, as opposed to, with that, and a more controlled management of that, looking at all the alternatives, including, as Darrel wants to say often, reducing demand. It's not just about production, it's also reducing the excessive demand that we put on our energy. So, from a very political point of view, and I am a politician for another 4 years at least, God willing, how do we unite some of the efforts of all those folks who want to see a more honest, accountable, competent government? And to me, that means simply reaching out to citizens who want to be part of something bigger. It means being willing to think about our party system that's not working for us in the center-left, and looking at ways we can come together. I tried to do that as leader in 2008 and 9, and that wasn't acceptable. The New Democrats wouldn't consider it. The Alberta Party wouldn't consider it, and it was seen as a weakness that the Liberals wanted to reach out and find some common ground and work together. And I was naive, frankly. I didn't know how to do it. I think I have a better idea now how to reach out and talk about working together and putting everything on the table and finding a way that, in the interests of Alberta, finding some common ground and going forward. So those are some of the things that I think need to happen. All the cards are in the hands of the government, as always. The money, the connections, the formal and to some extent the informal power in the society rests with them. The only way that's going to shift is one of two ways. Either the economy is going to take a dive, and they're going to have to take some responsibility for the fact that we still only have 75% of our budget within the public domain. We still depend for 25% of our budget on the price of oil every year. So we decide every year whether we're going to cut nurses and teachers or whether we're going to increase their numbers just on the basis of the price of oil. That's not acceptable. But in another sense, I think we need to hold accountable those that represent us and demand something more balanced. So we have to do a lot better as politicians. You have to do a lot more, be a lot more active as citizens, and somehow we need to also squeeze the media to do a better job of telling us what's really going on and how we can be a more active, influential part of our future.
Do you guys want to make a comment on the squeezing the media? And then you can address the
Be gentle in this case. Going back to a little bit what I talked about earlier is just how I think progressively, I think the progressive movement's going to come from the people. And so, again, become more engaged and, tell your political leaders, whatever party you stand for, want to get behind that, yeah, this isn't good enough, if you're a die-in-the-wool dipper, and you want to see some kind of coordination, with that party and the other parties, tell your leader that. Say, it's not good enough that you just say we're not going to cooperate because we're Democrats, and damn it, that's what we're going to do. We're not going to even fathom the idea of, cooperating with Liberals or the Alberta Party, or it's a ridiculous stance, I think. It's, and then, or with the Liberal parties, or the Alberta Party, it's, if you want to be viable in any political race, you can't be tossing in candidates after the writ has dropped and expect, it doesn't matter if you have a star candidate who's well known. If you're dropping a candidate 2 weeks after the writ has been dropped, you're not going to be considered a serious contender at all because you haven't been out there. So the political parties have to start building up candidates now for the next election. And it may not even work that election because it all comes down to timing. If the economy remains stable and if Alison Redford can show that she is truly the progressive that she says she is, and she can, gut some of the rot out of that PC party, it could be tough to beat the PCs. But if the PC party shows that they're just, going to keep on doing business as usual, and if the economy tanks or some kind of combination thereof, then the timing could be right that people are going to be finally fed up and want to get rid of that party. So it's just really, I think, being engaged, mobilizing, and not just once every 4 years. It's, be engaged as often you can in your communities. And pressure the media by all means, right? I mean, email me, say, why aren't you guys covering this story idea? That's what we're here to do. You people in the community know the issues that affect your communities the most, not us. I can't be everywhere. So let us know. And if we reported something incorrectly, let us know. I don't want to be running factually incorrect stories. That's not what I got into the business for. So.
Gillian, do you want to make a comment on that?
Well, I think the next 4 years or until the next election are going to be very interesting. I don't think you hear a lot of talk these days that Alberta's we're in another boom and everything's going to take off and oil sands development is going to save us all, and yet I'm not so sure. I don't think we're out of the woods yet in terms of the economy. The price of oil has gone down. It might go up again, but I think we live in really uncertain times. And if the price of oil does continue to go down, and you will likely see a slowdown in oil sands development, and then that will affect government revenues, and then we'll start to see them say, oh well, we got to cut this, we got to cut that. And also, it's usually what happens in Alberta if we go into tough economic times. People get angry, and that's where the wild rose came from. Right? They came from out of that period, that 2008, when things turned bad, and people got angry because they weren't making. The oil companies weren't doing as much drilling. There wasn't as much exploration. They weren't making as much money. They blamed Ed Stelmach for his royalty program. People got angry, and they turned, to the wild rose, where we turned to a new political party. And so, who's to say if times, get tough again? Maybe the wild rose actually might do well out of that, because I think they do. They can foster that kind of anger and that kind of, right-wing bitterness towards too many taxes, too much government spending, all that kind of thing. So they could do well out of that. If, if we continue on this path where actually, oil and gas is still selling for a good price, and this Alberta government can bring in enough revenue, and Alison Redford can be the progressive conservative that she wants to be and pay attention to the social side, then maybe things will settle down here. Who knows? I don't know. I don't think we can actually predict. I think times are really uncertain. I think there's a lot of volatility. I think people could, in fact, who knows, get upset about all kinds of issues. I think we're sitting on the edge of a big, national kind of dispute about our resources and what's happening in Eastern Canada. We've gotten a taste of that with the NDP leader saying, that this economy is too inflationary and it's causing too many problems for businesses down east, manufacturing sector, all that. We've got the Northern Gateway pipeline that certain interests are wanting to push through across, from Edmonton across to BC. There's a lot of opposition to that in British Columbia that is going to be directed our way. I mean, there's going to be a lot of really interesting things happening, and that doesn't even touch on the whole question of environmental issues on the oil sands, which, at some point, Alberta is going to have to stand up and say either we're doing things right, and here we can prove it, or we're going to do things better, and here we can prove it. Like, I think Alberta is a really exciting place to live right now. And I think the citizens that live in this place have a lot of power and a lot of, they're in a good position to really make their voices heard. I really do.
So I agree with a lot of what everybody has said. One of the things that I would advise is that, for David especially, I think you need a lot of credit, and I don't think you're accepting enough credit for holding this province from going into the right-hand ditch. Because a lot of... The work that you have done since you've entered public life has been just incredible. And you've done that in the face of just insanity in terms of the way that the issues have been covered. So, first of all, the notion that the Tories would have discovered the centre was only allowed to be foisted and put over on the public because of where we came from and how we got here. So, going forward, the issues are quite interesting because there are typically on from an electoral perspective, there are three legs on the stool. You either have money, machine, or you have message. And if you have the combination of those three things that is effective enough, then you can win. But there's a bigger question that's not asked and it needs to be asked. And that has to do with what the game is that you're playing. And so one of the things that I was advising long before the election ever happened was that if we kept playing the game that was being played, where we were so completely overwhelmed in terms of money and machine, if we didn't change the game, if we played their game on their field according to their rules, we were going to get creamed. And it happened 2 elections in a row, and I take no solace in saying, I told you so. And the reality is that there is a completely different game. And it was so profound that the Tories repeatedly sent cabinet ministers to Norway to try to figure out what the hell they're doing that makes so much sense. So the comparison of Norway and Alberta is an interesting one. They have a few more people, we have a little bit more oil. But if you look at every single comparison that matters to people, per capita income to everything all the way down the line, they beat us like you can't believe. They played a different game. They didn't jump into the climate change denial position that got Dr. Swann fired as an officer for the public health. They didn't do that at all. Norway, their first woman prime minister, Gro Harlem Brundtland, brought in a CO2 tax in 1990. A CO2 tax in 1990, and the oil companies screamed. Well, they said, too bad, so sad, get used to it. And they did. And all these years later, they established their Heritage Fund in 1990 as well. We were 14 years ahead of them. So where are we today in terms of the Heritage Fund? Alberta has, if we can find it, $15 billion. Norway has more than $500 billion. The cabinet ministers that the Tories would send to Norway would come back and they'd say, well, they're just a bunch of socialists. We have to learn how to make sure that that game is front and center, that the media has no choice, and that they have to deal with that. They have to deal with the big issues, the big public interests, and that we find a way so that the people like David Swann, who goes to work every single day thinking about one thing and one thing only, and that's how he can do his job for the Alberta public. Nothing else. That's what we need in governance, in figuring out what public policy is. Because as soon as we can get there, where government is actually trying to figure out what to do based on what makes sense, on the science and the evidence and rational analysis, then we get good governance.
Okay. I actually have a mic runner, that's fine, David. You can sit there. And
She's
we
way
can
ahead.
run a microphone. I want to ask a couple questions though. Who voted in the last election, just by a show of hands? Who had an Alberta Party candidate in their riding in the last election? And did everyone know who they were and what they represented? Okay. There are a couple people who were like, not nodding. They didn't know who the Alberta Party was. And they recently lost their last MLA, who was Dave Taylor, and so they no longer have a representative. So I want to discuss the Alberta Party and where you think they fit in the fold, because they went through their first election this past election, and what the potential is in terms of a new party and introducing that in provincial politics in this.